To understand why the Kyoto policy track failed, you have to go right the way back to its original formulation. It was based on three plausible parallels or analogies, which turned out to be dangerously misleading. The first of those was the way in which we handled the problems of stratospheric ozone depletion due to the emission of chlorofluorocarbons. And at first sight, climate change looks similar. It's about the emissions of a gas affecting the state of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, however, the chlorofluorocarbon issue turned out to be a very simple problem. We're talking about a suite of a small number of gases artificially produced by a small number of countries and a small number of firms, and very importantly, for which there was a readily available technological substitute. None of those conditions applies with carbon dioxide emissions, and even less so if you take into account the whole suite of greenhouse gases, which are produced all around the world by a multiplicity of natural and industrial processes, and in the case of carbon dioxide, where there's not simple, readily available substitutes that can immediately take over without some significant disruption. The second analogy was the sulfur trading program of the US Environmental Protection Agency that had been very successful in reducing sulfur emissions from coal power plants here in the US. And that basically was worked by allowing a small number of electric utilities to trade sulfur emissions in a market. And so it seemed to, particularly to neoclassical economists, that this was a very promising way to deal with climate change on an international scale. The problem is that the EPA sulfur emissions program was dealing with one gas, sulfur dioxide, small number of traders, electric utilities, under a single legal regime, the legal regime of the United States of America, that could enforce contracts against defaulters. Again, none of those conditions applied when you start to look at the problem of climate change. And the third analogy was the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Now, most people get the first two, but they don't get that third one. And that's because people forget that before he became a climate wonk, Al Gore was in fact a national security wonk who was very much involved with the design of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and from which was carried the idea of mutually verifiable reductions. Now, in the case of strategic arms, nuclear missiles, you're talking about mutually verifying the reduction in the number of warheads on a missile. When you're looking at actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's a much more difficult thing to actually be able to carry through. And it turned out, in fact, in the last round of negotiations, that it was precisely the monitoring of reductions that was the sticking point for China. So that turned out to be a big problem. So although these analogies seem to be very promising and to provide a way forward, I think that they have actually misled us quite significantly into wasting the last 10 to 15 years. So we felt that it was extremely important to have a major public investment in energy R&D. And not just R&D, but RD, D&D, where it's research, development, demonstration, and deployment. At the current moment, the last few years, the US has been spending around about $8 billion a year on energy R&D, most of which goes into coal and nuclear. We felt, at least as a starting point for thinking about how much we should be spending, we ought to look at how much the US spends on military R&D, not military expenditure, just R&D. And that turns out to be, as far as we can tell, around about $80 billion a year. So that's a huge gap that we think needs to be bridged in order to really suggest that we are taking seriously the strategic threat that climate change represents to the population. Well, thinking forward into the future about what we ought to be doing about climate change, I think the most important thing is to remember how to eat an elephant. And the answer to that is, of course, one piece at a time. One of the problems that we've had with climate change is we have loaded so many different issues onto the climate change agenda. It's an energy issue, it's a technology issue, it's an environmental issue, it's an economic issue, it's an international development issue, it's an equity issue, it's an international law issue. We've also been invoking climate change to try to resolve a whole range of other issues, poverty, fuel poverty, and so on and so forth. And we've reached the stage where really the bandwagon has collapsed because of the excessive weight that we put on it. And I think what we need to do is to do exactly the opposite, which is to start decomposing climate change into a number of bite-sized pieces that we can grapple with, And those bite-sized pieces that we should be grappling with first are the ones where there are very good reasons to be dealing with them other than for climate change. So, for example, we currently have a situation in which 1.6 billion of the world's population does not have access to reliable electrical energy. Quite honestly, at this stage in the 21st century, that should be offensive to most of us. It's a denial of basic, I think, human dignity to those populations. If we are going to provide that access to electrical energy, we're not going to be able to do it using traditional fossil fuels without clearly causing significant climate disruption. And in any case, in many cases, those are not the kinds of technologies which are best suited to the conditions in which that 1.6 billion people are living. In fact, much more decentralized kinds of ways of providing that electricity would be suitable. So we could pursue an agenda of energy modernization, providing that electrical energy to the poor. Another thing that we have to do is to give a much higher priority to adaptation than we have done in the past, and to recognize that, in fact, we're not adequately adapted to the climate as it exists today. So it's not about adapting to climate change necessarily, it's adapting to climate variability. After all, Hurricane Katrina cannot be shown to have been made any worse by climate change, and wasn't by any means the worst hurricane that has occurred in the last few decades. So we need to be better adapted to climate variability, and a lot of that's to do with things like putting expensive infrastructure in silly places. If you look at Miami Beach in 1920, it had one 6-story building on it. You look at it now, it's a wall of concrete and glass facing those winds and rains coming in directly off the ocean. Things like zoning, planning, and better city planning and development can help a tremendous amount in immediately today reducing loss of life and loss of property from extreme weather events, and at the same time will also help to protect us against any impacts from climate change going forwards.